I'm standing in our church's auditorium, as you can see. It's where we spend so much of our time as a church body, isn't it? And it's a beautiful one. Built in 1952 after a previous one was destroyed by a tornado. We've been gathering in this place as a church body for 65 years for worship. And that's what we've been talking all month long about. Worship as a spiritual practice which draws us closer to God. We've been talking about the Lord's Supper. What happens when we gather around the table of the Lord? We talked about singing. What happens as we sing praises to God? We even talked about Sabbath, the idea of taking sacred time out of our regular routines to dedicate to God. And we've talked about the idea that really, essentially, all that we do as we live our lives is a worship to God. But this week, I want us to focus on what happens when we gather together in the assembly of God. What happens when we come together in this place for worship? My experience has been that we typically think of worship in a couple of different ways. We think of the vertical relationship between us and God, that worship is us offering our praises and offerings to God. I still think the best definition of worship comes from the occasion when Jesus' disciples asked him what the greatest commandment in the old law was. And Jesus said, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength." I think that's what definition is, loving on God. And he goes on in that passage to say, and the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. There's the horizontal aspect to our worship where we are encouraging one another as we come together in worship. The Hebrew writer says in Hebrews 10 and 25, "Let's not give up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but let us encourage one another daily, and all the more as you see the day approaching." And yes, both of those things are going on. Those are important things. But I wonder if we haven't missed something. I wonder if there isn't something more going on in our worship. I wonder if we haven't even missed the point. Because you see, in both of those aspects, both in what we do in our praise to God and in what we do in our encouragement of one another, the focus is on what we do. And isn't that when we begin to have contentious discussions? Churches' history all over the country, churches have argued over acts of worship, and those have sometimes been difficult conversations. Is it okay to add new songs into our worship, or do we have to stick with the old standbys? Or go back a few decades. Is it okay to use the multiple cups in the Lord's Supper, or do we have to stick with just the one like Jesus used? Or is it okay to substitute grape juice for the wine that Jesus would have used? Is it okay to use aids in our singing, like multiple song leaders, or do we have to stick with just the one, as has been our tradition? And those discussions that churches have had have sometimes been very contentious. And those are discussions we may need to have, and I don't want to minimize their importance. But I wonder if we haven't missed the point when it comes to what worship really is. Maybe the more important question that we ought to ask is, what is God doing in our worship? Do we envision Him as just a spectator sitting back, waiting on us to see if we're going to do things decently and in order? Or is God at work doing something when we come together in the assembly? In Matthew 18, Jesus says to His disciples, He says, "Where two or three are gathered in my name, there I am with them also." The idea of Jesus being present in our worship, Jesus being with us as we come together in the assembly, how does that change the way that we think about worship? How does that change the way we think about the assembly? When we come to imagine that Jesus is here with us. That's a big deal. That was a big deal to Israel, to think about God being present with them. And it ought to be a big deal to us to think about Jesus being present with us as we gather in the worship assembly. That's what I encourage you to think about in your small groups, in your spiritual life groups this weekend. How does thinking about worship as being in the presence of God, as God's presence, as Jesus' presence, being with us in the assembly, how does that change our hearts and minds? If worship, as we come together in the assembly, if worship is a spiritual practice, how does that transform us more and more into the image of Jesus? Have a great group this weekend.